Hi, my name is Jackie. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 8. I play hard because that's how I do everything. I always push myself to be the best that I can be. Type 1 diabetes does not stop me from doing the things that I like to do. Hello and welcome to Teen 1D, the podcast for teenagers and young adults living with type 1 diabetes. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medicine advice or treatment. My guest for today is Dr. Scott Soleimanpour. Dr. Scott Soleimanpour is an associate professor of internal medicine, associate director for type 1 diabetes basic research and enrichment programs, investigator in the BREM Diabetes Research Center, co-director of the JDRF Center of Excellence, and director of the Diabetes Transition Program at the University of Michigan Medical School. So welcome to the podcast. We're so glad to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure. Looking forward to chatting and talking a little bit more to your audience about some of the work we're doing and also a little bit of my story.
Oh, definitely. I'm interested to hear both. So where did you grow up and when were you diagnosed with type 1?
Yeah. So I'm born and raised in Youngstown, Ohio. It's a small, used to be a steel town, about halfway between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, right on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. And I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 5 in 1986. So you could do the math and figure out how old I am, I guess. But yeah, so I was diagnosed relatively young, and everything kind of changed after that, which for most folks with type 1, it usually changes things.
Oh, definitely. So how do you manage your type 1 compared to how you managed it when you were first diagnosed?
If you go look in the history books, there were insulin pumps. I obviously didn't know that at the time, but the insulin pumps that you see on the web are these backpack-looking large contraptions, right? So it was a different time. We were using, there were still some folks using animal insulins. I think I was one of the newer folks getting human insulin. We were starting to use these things called chem strips. These were the forerunners before glucometers. So it was really quite different. And the types of insulin and the way that the insulins worked back then are now some of these insulins, unfortunately, are starting to come back into use because of cost and how expensive insulin is. These new insulins are for our patients. But the insulins at that time, you were taking only 2 shots a day. You were thinking about lows between meals because of the way the insulins worked. And the targets, how tight our blood sugars needed to be in that era, people just didn't know. They didn't know. So, I had blood sugars that weren't nearly what they should be. I'd have lows in the middle of the night. Although I guess lots of folks with type 1 still do. But I didn't have a sensor, I didn't have a pump. So it was really a different time, and it makes me feel older thinking about how far we've come, but it's a good time. If we're going to have type 1, it would be better to have it now with all the things we have at our disposal.
Yes, I totally agree. And even since I was first diagnosed when I was 8, there's just been this total shift in technology. I just know with continuous glucose monitors and pens themselves. Do you think that being diagnosed at such a young age interfered with your ability to participate in anything growing up?
No, I don't think so. My parents were pretty motivated to make sure that there was a good coordinated plan for my diabetes. So I was pretty fortunate that they, and I think for a lot of folks, type 1 is not just the disease of the child or the patient or whomever. It's a family thing, and everything in the family changed. My mom started cooking different types of food, took that quite seriously. My father was really on top of my insulin doses, and then getting me to see physicians to kind of take care of things. Getting involved in lots of different sports was pretty important because they knew that exercise was good to keep my blood sugars under control. And indirectly, my brother was affected too, because, some of the snack food that maybe was around before I was diagnosed kind of disappeared afterwards. And he kind of knew as a younger brother, he still had to keep a lookout to make sure if big brother didn't look quite right or if something was bothering him. So, I mean, it really affected everyone. And, I was lucky to have people pulling together to help me. But I was able to do things that other people did. I played on varsity sports teams. I participated in activities all through, grade school through middle school to high school. I just always had to be a little bit more careful because again, there were no sensors around. So, if I had a low, I had to kind of feel it, and that was it. But otherwise, I felt like a relatively normal kid, I think.
Yeah. And I definitely agree just with the family statement that you made. It definitely, I can just tell from like a family perspective, it is not just like a thing for one person. It is something that a whole family has to deal with as well.
Mhm. And
So,
that never stops, right? So I have 3 young kids, and I'm married, and I met my wife in my residency, and thankfully, I'm very lucky. She's a healthcare provider, so as a nurse, she knows all about diabetes, and this has become part of her life too, right? So it affected family at a young age, and it still does. My kids know that daddy takes medicine, and sometimes there are certain foods that daddy can't have, or the like. So it never stops. It's always part of who you are, and your relationships, I think.
so you mentioned your residency. At what age did you discover that you wanted to become a doctor?
If you ask my parents, they said when I was so now, if it's again talking about different times. When you're diagnosed with diabetes now, certainly I've taken care of a number of young folks and the like who come into the hospital, get diagnosed with diabetes. Oftentimes they're sent home the next day.
Wow.
They may stay in the hospital longer, say if they're in the intensive care unit with diabetic ketoacidosis and they need to be on IV insulin. But most of the time, admissions and diagnoses of type 1, you're in and out of the hospital pretty quickly. And there's an educational pipeline that you get into. When I was diagnosed with type 1 in the 80s, it was a 2 to 3 week hospitalization. I was in, I stayed there. They watched me very carefully. They had lots of intensive education for my parents on the insulins and how to give it to me. I was trying to be taught about my diabetes, but I was 5, so it was only so much I could grasp. But if according to my parents, what they remember is that I was following the medical teams around, the nurses around, the doctors around. I wanted to get to know the other kids that were admitted. I wanted to help out. So, I felt like I had that bug relatively early after my diagnosis. And, it kind of was the paradigm shift of my life, right? Everything kind of fell from that moment. It still has. So I think maybe I didn't know that I was going to be doing exactly this job today, but I pretty much knew that I was going to work. I wanted to work with diabetes at a very young age.
Then where did you go to college and medical school?
Yeah. So so I finished high school a little young. I was 16 when I finished high school. Um, and when I was applying to college, because I was a little younger than most folks going to college, my parents were nervous sending their 16-year-old off to live alone. Um, so I applied to a number of schools, and like I said, I grew up in Ohio. I applied to schools all over the country, and I got into some places I really wanted to go on the West Coast. Um, but the family was not so thrilled about me disappearing to the West Coast with this disease, and how could I manage living alone. At the same time, I applied to a 6-year combined BSMD program. That's in a small med school called Northeast Ohio Medical University. And it had affiliated undergraduates. So you went to undergrad for 2 years and you basically went all year round. You didn't get summers off or anything. So you could finish your undergrad in 2 years. And then you would have 4 years of med school. And so I I gained admittance to that 6-year program. And right around that time, I was talking to my folks. It would save us a lot of money because, it was in state. I'd be closer to home. I'd have a lot more support. And so my folks said, well, look, I had to start college then 2 weeks after high school commencement. They said, go to this school over the summer, see what you think. If you really want to move out west and go to college out west, then you can still enroll there in the fall. And so I started, and I really liked it, and it was really, really convenient to be close to home and still be able to focus. And I made good friends, and I just stuck with it, and I was really happy with that decision.
That sounds great. Just in terms of being able to have that whole undergraduate time period cut down into 2 years, did it actually create a more stressful environment or a less stressful environment for you?
You know, I'm kind of one of those people that once I dive into something, then I just say, this is it. And then I don't think about it. But, at the time, there were certainly people that were saying, look, you're 16, like, what's the rush? And why do you want to get to medical school so fast? And they asked me that when I was interviewing for this program, because one of the concerns that a lot of the faculty have there is that you're finishing college and med school in 6 years instead of 8. So that means that it's a bunch of doctors coming out younger. And are they going to be more immature? And then I was 16 on top of that. And so there were a lot of people saying, well, slow down. But I think this is where having diabetes changes your perspective. And so, again, this is like now the mid 90s, early 90s at this point. And I'm starting to learn more about my disease. I'm learning more about diabetes complications. And yes, I'm 16 or 17, but like when you have diabetes, you're not dense, that the disease can kill you. And so I said, there's a reason I'm rushing, because I want to get to the end game where I'm helping people. I like the idea of having fun in college and, being a student, but I like the idea more of, I worked really hard to get to this point in my life, and anything I could do to get there sooner to me was worth it. So going to school over the summer, yeah, I would have liked to maybe relax or travel or do whatever, but I made a lot of really good friends that were in the same boat as me, and so then it didn't feel quite so bad. We were all in it together, my classmates, and it was fun. So I just kind of said, yeah, okay, that's no big deal, and then I just went for it.
A number of our listeners may be interested in a medical field, medical school, and medical research. Do you have any advice for what to look for in a college med school or looking for research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the first thing I would say is there is generally a belief that the name of the school that you go to is the most important thing. And, I think I feel pretty comfortable in my place in life that I can tell you that isn't the end all be all. I went to a small, Kent State's not a small university, but certainly not known as some elite top 10, top 25 college in the United States. My med school, was a small med school, not really interested in basic research, mostly interested in primary care. Most of the graduates stay in Ohio. So again, not an elite medical school. But my path, has very happy with where things have gone. And so the name of the place doesn't matter. What matters is what you do once you're there. So I tell people that don't feel obstructed because you went to a smaller school. If you go there and you do great in your classes, if you do things to set yourself apart from your classmates, whether that's additional time working in a research lab, working and volunteering in the hospital, things that you can do to distinguish yourself from other people beyond being elite in the classroom. To me, that's an important decision. Now, if you're interested in research for diabetes, the one thing that became apparent to me at the school that I was at was that it was a smaller college, smaller med school. And so there was not as many opportunities in a very, very focused area that I was interested in. It wasn't that there wasn't research around. But because I had type 1, that's all I wanted to study. So that started to narrow the lists of places that I could do research training. And so my only advice for folks that are very focused on that is that then you have to start looking around for where the opportunities are and cast a broad net, and see if people are willing to take a chance on giving you an opportunity, whether it's to volunteer in a lab as an undergrad or as a medical student, and then pick up useful information and see if what kind of career you want with diabetes, because diabetes changes your life. It changes everyone's lives in a different way. And not everyone's going to be a doctor. They might want to be, but they might not. But you may want to do something related to your type 1. The only way you're going to know what that thing is if you have multiple opportunities around you to try out and see what you like.
What sort of research have you done related to type 1?
When I was a first year med student, again, email was kind of a new thing. There were flyers that came around that were passed around our quad at the med school. And I had a classmate who I shared a study carrel with who brought this flyer from Vanderbilt. And he said, look, they're looking for medical student or first year, second year med students who want to do a summer doing diabetes research. And you had to send in an application and they'd interview you and then you might get in. And he said, hey, I know you have diabetes. I thought you might be interested in this. And so, at the same time, I was basically kind of more or less cold calling folks, in different places, seeing if they'd be willing to take an undergraduate volunteer, like unpaid. So, I had some family in Southern California. I thought, well, maybe I could do something out there. I got in, I was, trying to figure out where things would fit, or if I should work with like a clinical endocrinologist in my hometown for the summer, just kind of on the side. So I met with a basic research faculty member who was a PhD microbiologist, didn't know anything about diabetes research, taught first year med students, but he was not a practicing physician. And so he said, well, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, I want to cure type 1 diabetes. And he said, well, that's a pretty big goal. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, how do you think you find that cure? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, I guess you work in a research lab, or maybe you do clinical research or the like. And he said, well, let me ask you this. He said, do you want to be the person discovering the cures, or do you want to be the person administering them? And I said, well, I want to be the person discovering the cures. And he said, well, that happens in a basic molecular biology lab. And so he said, I don't know if you're going to like this Vanderbilt opportunity, but if you do, then you might want to think about what it means for your life. And so up until that point, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I just thought I was going to take care of kids with type 1 and then maybe miraculously get to work with new drugs for type 1. I had no plan. So I went and did this program. I got into this program at Vanderbilt, and then I kind of took off from there. So the summer I was there, I worked for the chair of molecular physiology and biophysics. It was actually a lab that studied glucose physiology, lipid metabolism. It was actually a little bit more oriented towards type 2 diabetes. And I remember getting down there being a little grumpy. And the head of the program, who still kind of an informal mentor to me, said, at this stage of your career, the project is not important. It's the mentor, it's the learning. And so he said, you got to stick with it. And he turned out to be totally right. So I kind of learned the skills of functioning in a research lab. I made good connections in the lab. I learned a whole lot more about glucose physiology and how insulin is used and metabolized. And the one key element, because it was only 10 weeks, the one key element that I really learned was I want to do more research. I knew that it was for me. And so at the end of that summer, I applied, or the following year when I went back to med school, I applied for a Howard Hughes Fellowship at the NIH in Washington, D.C. And I was actually also applying for an ADA fellowship that was going to send me back to the lab at Vanderbilt that I worked at, but they were going to help me arrange a project related to islet cell transplantation. So you and your listeners might know about that. But at the time, this is now year 2000, 2001, this was like the hot new research item in type 1 diabetes, where you could get islets from a donor who had passed away, and then put those islets into a patient with type 1 and give them immunosuppressive drugs. And then voila, they have islets now and insulin producing cells now, and they get off insulin. So this was the hot thing. And so I got into both programs, and I had to decide where to go. And both of them had islet transplantation research. So I decided to go to DC. I wanted a kind of a new experience, new mentorship. And I spent that year working in islet cell transplantation. But the skills I learned at Vanderbilt in glucose physiology, I applied it to that project. And so then I spent off and on about 2 years at the NIH. I went back to med school, went back to the NIH again, before I went to my residency and fellowship. And so I had to do clinical training because I graduated with an MD. But then when I got to my fellowship, I had the opportunity to, by that point, I guess 5 years had elapsed, to get back into the lab. And there were still opportunities to work in islet transplantation, but by that point, time had passed. And it was clear we didn't know why these islet transplants weren't working. Patients would get off insulin, and then within a couple of years, they'd go back on insulin. And so I thought, it would be really good to understand what makes these islet cells tick, what makes these insulin-producing beta cells tick, what makes them grow and die, divide, and change their identity. And so I decided I wanted to get real fundamental basic beta cell biology as the course of my postdoctoral training. And that's what I did. And that's what I continue to do is study beta cell biology to see if we can coax those cells to work better and bring them back in people with type 1.
Wow, that's certainly impressive.
Well, it sounds much better when you condense a bunch of years into a couple of minutes, right?
And so with the beta cells trying to make them work again, how exactly does that process work?
Well, I think it's probably pretty easy to say it's complicated, right?
Yes.
So, we now know a considerable amount more about how you get type 1 diabetes, a lot more than when I was diagnosed. And I think for a long time, and still, in textbooks and what you learn, they say, well, type 1 is an autoimmune disease, right? So immune system comes along, kills the beta cells, you get diabetes, you take insulin rest of your life, that's the way it is, right? The reality is it's a little bit more messy than that. And it's probably not as simple as that. So I think now the more evolved look at type 1 is that it's a multi-system disease. It isn't an immune disease only. We now know that beta cells in patients who have type 1, those beta cells don't work right. Probably prior to getting the disease, those beta cells didn't work right. We do know that you have probably a messed up immune system that also isn't working properly. But also we know that the rest of the pancreas probably also has issues. We don't quite know why. The remainder of the pancreas, the parts of your pancreas that make digestive enzymes, we don't really know, but patients with type 1 have problems in the remainder of their pancreas too. Now they may not feel those problems, but when you study the pancreas of folks with type 1, things aren't quite right throughout the pancreas. And one thing that is very relatively recently new knowledge is we have a lot of microbes that live in our intestine that help us digest foods and fuels. It turns out there's good bacteria and bad bacteria in the digestive tract, and that people with type 1 have different types of microbes. Now, we don't know how they got there. We don't know what they mean, but we know they're different. And we know they probably in some way interface with the immune system. And so to me, that means you've got 4 different organs at least, and there might be more, in type 1 that are not working properly. So it's not as simple as, oh, just go fix the immune system and you've got this thing licked, right? And so that means that it's going to take a tremendous effort to bring those beta cells back. What's going wrong in those beta cells to begin with? It's probably a combination of many things. These beta cells are probably weaker. We use a term called beta cell fragility, meaning that they're fragile beta cells. They can't handle any stress. Probably because they can't handle the stress, they are more apt to release signals outside the beta cell in these islets in the pancreas that tell the immune system, hey, there's something wrong with me, come kill me. And probably also there's the insulin that's made in the beta cells probably in some way triggers the immune system too. And so sometimes stressed or inappropriately acting beta cells, they make different hybrid types of insulin that shouldn't be exposed to the immune system. And then these abnormal immune cells pick it up and go, oh, this is weird. This shouldn't be here. We should get rid of these cells. And then I think lastly, there's probably a role for viruses too in the process, whether it's a trigger, whether it infects the beta cell directly and makes it look less normal. So, there are many things at play. And so what it means is how you fix the beta cell is you have to it takes a global effort of scientists all over the world. And right now the JDRF NPOD meeting is ongoing, which is a meeting dedicated to the study of type 1. And it takes people like me who study beta cells and other folks that study immune cells talking to each other about what we're learning and seeing how we can bring things together and stitch ideas together to try to either prevent those beta cells from dying in someone at risk for type 1, or seeing if you can regenerate those beta cells in somebody who already has type 1.
And you mentioned JDRF, and you are the co-director of the JDRF Center of Excellence.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about the Center of Excellence and how you got involved?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So this is a pretty new endeavor. The JDRF obviously is a very important foundation dedicated to type 1 diabetes research and advocacy. So they give direct funds for diabetes research. They also lobby the NIH to support diabetes research and Congress to do the same thing. These centers of excellence are really new. And the idea, and I can't speak for JDRF, but, we were presented with a really unique opportunity at Michigan to do something a little different. Rather than giving out individual research grants to independent researchers, their leadership at some elite diabetes centers nationwide and worldwide, formed a collaborative set of ideas to present to JDRF to say, what if we put a little bit more time and dedicated funds to allow for collaborative teams and networks at a specific institution that might be very heavy in diabetes researchers, to see if they could synergize and build something a little bit more than, say, one isolated research lab working kind of on their own. And so, I was kind of lucky to be recruited into this effort. We have a really big diabetes community at Michigan, and they wanted involved in that community someone that studies beta cells, someone that understands the genetics of type 1, someone interested in diabetes regenerative therapies to bring beta cells back. And so I was lucky to be part of the crew, but we have at least our Michigan center, and there are now 4 centers, 3 in the United States, one in Canada. So only 4 centers worldwide. Our center, as opposed to the other 3, is very unique in that we have a very large clinical research component to our center, where some of the other centers are very focused on bench research. So we have a lot of patients enrolled in clinical trials. We're very interested in studying parameters that lead to burden of disease, diabetes complications, psychosocial aspects of diabetes, machine learning for automated pump therapies, all the way down to what myself and a colleague of mine, Lonnie Shea, are doing, who's a biomedical engineer, trying to develop the right environments to grow new beta cells from stem cells for transplantation.
That is fantastic that all of these organizations are working together.
It's great. And you know, the key element that kind of made it go, that's making it go, is that it's not only the JDRF making this happen. The JDRF is building partnerships with the leaderships at these different universities. And so one of the keys was that the U of M leadership had to be willing to match funds and raise funds to match what JDRF was giving. So, you know, U of M has skin in the game too. And so then you can really see that there's a true dedication to developing new and innovative therapies to treat folks with type 1 diabetes.
Wow, that's all I can say about that. That's
Yeah, it's
crazy.
wild, right? So I pinch myself too. I mean, it's as a researcher, it's this is kind of a dream come true, because you know, I spend a lot of my time writing research grants so that I can do cool experiments. But through this opportunity, you know, we get a little bit of breathing room and space to come up with neat ideas and then see where they go. And having you know, good support around you is it's essential to make progress.
Do researchers prepare a publication for each finding or only significant findings?
So, you know, when we often, you know, communication is really important in what we do. Doesn't matter if you study diabetes or you study hangnails. I mean, you have to be able to communicate that with your scientific colleagues and then eventually with everybody. Certainly some things are very technical, and you know, people might not want to read the really technical stuff. But how we communicate our findings are now in more broad ways than it used to be. The classic is a scientific publication that is peer reviewed by colleagues in your field, that are published in journals. You know, generally we often say we want to tell a story, and it's a smaller story, but can sometimes take years of work. So it's a series of findings, or in the case of a clinical trial that sees many patients, that goes over years, and you're accumulating information that helps you tell the story of your finding, what the significance is. For me as a basic researcher, understanding a really critical, what may be very, very tiny molecular mechanism that fills in big gaps in the big picture of the disease. And so at the end of, you know, a process, and it's sometimes up to the research head of a lab to say, you know, this is a good compact unit. We're going to write up a manuscript and we're going to describe our findings and send it out. And then your colleagues peer review it. They either say this is terrible, and they reject it, say go back to work, and you either have to shop it to a new journal or you have to go back to your lab and do more work. Or if the journal likes it, if the reviewers like it at a journal, they say, oh, well, go do these extra things, or we have a few questions, or, you know, this doesn't make sense, explain this more. And so then you revise it and you update your findings, you integrate more information, and then you send it back and you hope it gets published, and then it's out there for public consumption. And large percentage of what I do is not only write papers and do the research, is read other people's papers so I can learn new ideas and bring new things to bear so we can kind of keep advancing the field. So it's not always like every time. Now, you said, do you only publish significant findings? You know, I think we always are excited to show discoveries that are important. But sometimes, you know, you do an experiment and your hypothesis, you know, somebody says your hypothesis is wrong. It's not really what it is. It's you're trying to disprove what's called a null hypothesis, meaning that this thing, protein A, does nothing. And you're saying, well, no, I don't think protein A does nothing. I think protein A may do this. And so you're trying to disprove this idea that protein A doesn't do anything important. Well, sometimes you don't disprove it. You mess with the protein, you knock it out, you put more of it in, nothing happens. Those findings are still important. And so I think, we as a field are starting to appreciate that it's the effort, it's the findings that if you find something that doesn't lead to a cure or doesn't fix some key molecular understanding that we don't have, that's still important. That still should be out there so that people aren't duplicating things that have already been done.
Yes, and this is a far less serious question, but do you enjoy writing publications?
It's funny. I often think a little bit about how I got to where I am in life, and so, I was good at math and science as a kid. It wasn't that I was a bad writer, but it wasn't. I wasn't in. What were those competitions like Power of the Pen or these different types of writing competitions? I never could hang with those. I was a never particularly gifted creative writer. But what I realize now is that my writing is critical for what I do. I have to write scientific papers. I have to write research grants so people fund our research. I have to give seminars and tell people what we're doing. So writing and public speaking is just as important, if not more important at some points, than knowing the basic cell biology and molecular biology that I really dove into. So I'm still getting better at that. And it's a challenge for me, and I certainly get my fair share of writer's block, but I've embraced it more because it's essential. It's an essential life skill for what I do now.
Yes, and you are an associate professor at the University of Michigan's medical school. Can you share with us what you teach and how you mentor students? I know you've mentioned your own mentors, but how do you mentor students?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've been teaching our first year medical students basic diabetes course, for about 5 to 6 years consistently. And then for about, several years before that, and also when I was faculty at Penn, I was teaching small groups related to diabetes clinical care. So I do some teaching in the medical student arena. I also train and teach graduate students and postdoctoral research fellows in my basic research lab. And that's not quite what you call didactic learning, when like you're sitting in a lecture hall and someone's talking at you. That's a little bit more of like apprenticeship style learning. So we're helping them learn how to do research techniques, formulate hypotheses, go execute experiments, and that's also teaching. My mentorship style builds upon the way that I was mentored. A trainee comes to you and they have some faith that you have some good ideas. And what I often try to do is to learn a little bit about what the trainees want to do, what their interests might be. If they sought me out to work in my lab, like, well, what appealed to you about what we do? And I have a variety of different interests, centralized around beta cells. And so we have some projects that are usually in development, or projects that are funded, but maybe there's no champion to push the project. And so I try to talk to folks about their interests and find something that they're passionate about. Because the one thing I tell folks that work for me is, I can give you every resource under the sun. I can find you every collaborator. We could buy you every reagent possible. But if you don't care, it doesn't matter. And so I think that's the most important thing I can do as a mentor, is try to find things that my trainees are excited to do, and then cheer them on and support them, because research is hard. Things fail. Things aren't always clean or always easy to figure out. There are stumbles along the way, and it's a slog. It's not like you're watching an episode of like CSI or something and you see people pipette colored liquids and then magically like, oh, they figured out, right? it's much more involved than that, and it's a long process, and so you need supporters. And so I realized that not only do I have to be there to cultivate the way someone thinks and approaches an experiment and help them design the best experiments or troubleshoot their findings, but you have to support folks from a in an uplifting way that says, you're going to figure this out. We're a team. We're going to pull together, and we're going to get jobs done. And to me, that's fun, seeing folks in my lab come in with maybe limited background or expertise in an area, and then really grow and become an expert in what they're doing, to be able to go talk to other people with a sense of enthusiasm and confidence. That makes me happy, really happy.
One of the big questions that's often proposed is the cure for type 1. And I've heard from other people that there will be several different cures, but what is your own personal answer when people ask you what the cure will be?
So, I'm certainly, you and folks that listen, right? They have type 1 or family members afflicted with type 1. When I was a kid, my parents would take me to see my diabetes doctor. And, they'd always ask the doctor, right? You go to your doctor, you want them to help you take care of your disease, but you don't want to have this disease, right? And so, parents ask, and I was too young to ask, right? They told me I had a lazy pancreas. I don't even know what that was, but I said, okay, I have a lazy pancreas. I have to take this insulin. So my parents would ask, well, when is there going to be a cure for his diabetes, right? And this is in the 80s, right? Late 80s. They'd say, oh, it's coming. In a few years, they have this thing figured out. And so when people ask me about a cure for type 1 now, I've reflected, and they continued to say this to my parents as I was growing up. I don't know if doctors said this to your folks or to you. It was probably one of the most, now when I look back, it was probably one of the most frustrating things somebody said to me. Because as a kid, I was like, I just got to hang on for a little bit, and then this thing will be done. I'll be fine, right? I've had this disease for more than 35 years, right? So it's clearly not. Now, don't get me wrong, things are better, but there's no cure. So my first thing when people ask me about a cure is I say, don't lie to people. And I'm not saying that they were being intentionally dishonest. They were being optimistic. That's fine. I like optimism too. But I try to level with people and be honest, and not in a pessimistic way. To say this is really hard and complicated to figure out. And it's going to take years of incremental progress, little steps. Maybe there will be a eureka moment. I don't know. So that's the first thing. I just want to kind of get that out of the way. And it's not to bum people out. It's the idea that I want you. So when I'm seeing my patients and they ask me that, right? So I still take care of patients. I say, my number one job is to keep you healthy as possible and tip top. So when that cure does show up, whether it's now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 25 years from now, that you're healthy enough to get it. So you don't lose faith or sight on what's important in front of you. Now, what is this cure going to look like? I think it depends on what cure means to you. So, we are in an age where insulin pump therapy is getting so much better. We have our first hybrid closed loops. Eventually, we're going to have the true artificial pancreas. Maybe this automated system that does insulin and glucagon and lets us eat and don't have to think about taking it. We just have to refill the pump up and then put it on and go forget about it. It's pump's got it. I don't have to think about it. And certainly I'd like to think that's probably around the corner sooner rather than later, just given where our pumps and glucose sensors are right now. For some people, that's not a cure, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't define it as such. For some people, it's a lasting therapy of some kind. Cells that make insulin in your body, an immune system that doesn't reject your beta cells or attack them. that's certainly what I'm working on in my lab. And so that's something I care about. So I'd love to define it that way. But I think it is different for every person. I think ultimately none of us want to be burdened with this disease or be afraid of complications. So, I think that we're doing, just recently, the first 2 clinical trials of stem cell transplants for type 1 diabetes were published. There's more stem cell studies on the way. They're really early. Patients didn't come off insulin. They still needed immunosuppressants. They had these cells in these encapsulation systems. Not all the cells that they put in actually made insulin. But it's baby steps, right? So, as long as there's progress, I think people should keep the faith, stay enthusiastic, realize that it's a long fight. Keep supporting people doing diabetes research. I mean, heck, research of all kinds, right? There's just more than one disease out there. If you have type 1, there's a good chance you might get another disease, right? So as long as you keep the faith and you do your part, taking care of yourself with the best that we have available, then it's up to folks like me to do our part and keep trying to work hard to deliver. But who knows when the end will be in sight. But of course, I'm hoping it'll be sooner rather than later.
Can you tell us about the diabetes transition program at the University of Michigan and how you
Sure.
are involved in it?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm primarily a basic researcher, and I see patients, but that's not because of the time involved in running a research lab, you can't do it all. But I do run a clinical program too, and that's a clinical program. So this started shortly after I got to Michigan. I've been at Michigan 8 years. So, within the first year or 2 of me setting up my lab, I was sitting with my division chief, and he was talking about the issues that the program was having, the adult, and I'm an adult endocrinologist, the issues the adult endocrinology program was having, getting young folks with type 1 who were kind of what we would call graduating from pediatric endocrinology to come see the adult providers. Blood sugar control in young adults with type 1 is the worst of any age group. There are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, you're at that age, right? So there's a lot going on, right?
Yes.
So, and I was there once too. Sometimes those other things get in the way of taking care of your diabetes. And so, if diabetes is hard control anyways. And then you add growing up, figuring out where your life is going, working and maybe a job, going to school full time, moving away to college, everything. And then you have to keep up on your medicines and then go to see a doctor and then change doctors. And then, things fall apart. Oh, I didn't go to the doctor. Oh, I got this. Oh, who cares about this blood sugar thing? And then what happens is a lot of young adults come back when they get a little older, they're in their 30s, and they go back and see a diabetes doc. Well, now they've had 10, 15 years of really bad blood sugar control, and complications start taking hold. And the first thing they say is, man, I wish I could have gone back and done it over again. So we know keeping young people engaged now when they move from their pediatric provider to an adult provider are important. That's what our transition program does. So this was a little bit of a program that kind of started from the heart, right? This is something that matters to me personally. And so, what we did was to find a group of adult endocrinologists who are really passionate about type 1 and taking care of folks with type 1. Because, in adult endocrinology, we see a lot of patients with type 2 diabetes. We see patients with other endocrine diseases. And so sometimes patients don't feel like, especially type 1 patients, that their doc is listening to them, knows about what they're going through. And if you're young, they say, oh, they don't know about the challenges of being a college student with diabetes. So, I was lucky to recruit some colleagues that were really interested in type 1 clinical care. And then simultaneously, we formed a really tight partnership with our friends in pediatric endocrinology who also see this as a problem. And they see it much more so as a problem than adult docs normally do. And we realized we had to build a network of how do we do handoffs? How do we get the folks to us? What are the critical skills that our patients need to learn? It's not as simple as like, oh, how do you use your pump or your sensor, right? How do you, as a young adult, how do you deal with like drinking alcohol if you have type 1? Like there's no manual for that. And you know what? Young people go to college, they drink. Your pediatric doctors probably might not talk to you about that. How do you deal with an insurance company? Again, if you're a kid with type 1, your parents might have dealt with it. Well, how do I order supplies? How do I talk? What's a DME? Where do I get my insulin and my test strips? How can I afford these things? And so, these are like real life skills. How do you eat with type 1 in a dorm? So we devised an education program that was just as important as the core providers who really care about type 1, because we wanted to help people have the life skills to be able to deal with type 1 in that age group. So the goal of this program is give people the know-how, find them physicians that can like deal with them on a, face-to-face level, like level with folks. I know what you're going through. We see folks that are going through this. And then the number one goal is to keep people engaged. We don't want you to disappear. We know if you disappear, that your likelihood of doing well goes down. So sometimes our goal is not perfect hemoglobin A1C, perfect blood sugar control. Sometimes our goal is just keep you in the fold, because we know that we can keep working on you, and maybe eventually those blood sugars will get better. But if you disappear, then you don't hear us. It's like stopping going to the dentist. Well, if you stop going to the dentist and you go back after 15 years and you're like, oh, my teeth are terrible. It's like, if you kept going to the dentist, they'll keep telling you to floss. They'll keep telling you to brush your teeth. They'll deal with little problems as they arise. And so it's that same philosophy, keep you engaged. Maybe don't make it as painful as drilling into your teeth. And then, hopefully let folks, as they grow up, grow into their diabetes management, and then feel empowered to take control of your own blood sugar management.
That is such a great program. Thank you for being a part of that.
Oh yeah, sure. I do it because I like it. It's definitely not what I get paid to do, but it's something I care about quite a bit.
Yes. Okay. And so I'm going to ask you two final questions. So we've about reached the end of this episode. Do you have any advice for teenagers or young adults with type 1 who may be going off to college or living on their own for the first time?
You have to think ahead and be prepared. And that means, all of these things we talked about, get good information on what you need to make sure that your diabetes doesn't run your college experience. The things that I talked about, understanding how to deal with insurance, how to get your supplies, how to eat in the cafeteria, on a meal plan in college. Where can you go for your diabetes care? Where can you store your insulin in your room? If you live in a dorm that's shared and has shared refrigerating space, and where can you put your supplies? Like, figure out the details, and then figure out contingencies, because things don't always go well. So do you have people around you that you can rely on or go to for help in case something goes wrong? Low blood sugar, high blood sugar, especially if you go away to school far from home. I stayed nearby, but not everyone has to. I think those things really, really matter. And then find good partnerships on the campus to kind of lend a hand. There are a number of college diabetes network chapters at numerous universities across the country. Not every university, but lots of them have them. I was a faculty mentor for one at Penn when they formed the Penn College Diabetes Network chapter. I was the first faculty advisor. When I moved my lab to Michigan 8 years ago, they asked me to be their faculty advisor for a few years. So a lot of folks with type 1 feel like they have a community. And CDN chapters can be like that, but you don't have to have one. Although some people say, well, if they don't have one, I'm going to form one and I'll create a community. But I think those are really important pieces of advice, because you don't have to go to college and study biology and want to cure diabetes. You might want to go to college and study anything but you want to make sure that you're kind of synchronized with your diabetes so you can really enjoy being in college.
Because all of us are more than our type 1, I like to ask my guests what they like to do in their free time. Do you have any recommendations for books, TV shows, or movies, or would just like to share anything that you do in your free time?
Oh, sure. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, this could turn into a really long podcast. So I'm a little bit of a homebody. Like I said, I'm married. I have 3 little kids. We have 3 cats and a dog. So I enjoy being with them. That's fun for me. And so that's probably my number one use of my free time is being with family. I'm a sports fan. I grew up in Ohio, so I enjoy abusing myself by watching Cleveland sports teams not usually win very much. So that kind of is a little bit of keeps me close to my hometown. And then I like science fiction. So I really enjoy basically any kind of science fiction movie, book, TV series you can name. I think Star Trek was the formative one when I was a kid. I still enjoy it. But that was probably one that really kind of got my imagination going. And probably lately is a show that just ended on Amazon called The Expanse. That's one that's my current sci-fi obsession.
All right. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here and for being a guest. My
pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and
yes.
Look forward to catching up and hearing how you all are doing, and folks in the community, if they ever have interest in learning more about what we do. We have a Twitter feed that they're welcome to follow. It's at Soleimanpour Lab. I'm happy to answer emails. It's listed on our lab website, and keeping in touch with the diabetes community is an important part of being a diabetes researcher. So look forward to doing that, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much.